All right, everybody, so today we're going to start talking about the Vietnam War. So today we're going to take a look at kind of what started the Vietnam War and the escalation kind of leading up to the United States becoming involved in the conflict. So our objectives and standards. Understand the struggles that France faced in the region. Explain how the United States became engaged in the conflict, and take a look at the standards too, please. Our desired result, how did the United States become engaged in the conflict in Vietnam? All right, we have a couple of vocab words here. Viet Minh, an organization whose goal was independence of Vietnam from foreign control. Domino theory, a theory that stated that countries on the brink of communism are waiting to fall one after another. The Geneva Accords, a peace agreement that temporarily divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel. Viet Cong, a group in South Vietnam of communist opposition members. I just want to explain that real quick. So in South Vietnam, which was, you'll find out, was more democratic, kind of, I guess you should say. They had communist, people in the country who were, opposed to this. So they were, communist, and so they were, opposing the South Vietnamese government. And then we have Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which was a resolution of broad military powers in terms of action in Vietnam. So supporting the French had wanted to reestablish control in French Indochina following World War II. You see it's identified there in the green part of the map there, and you can kind of see in the other small little corner there where it is in comparison to the rest of the world. So Vietnam was French Indochina at this time, and during the French Indochina War, the United States supported the French effort with military and economic support. So the French had ruled the area from the late 1800s until World War II. The problem with this was, just like as we've talked about a lot with a lot of imperialism, is they used peasant lands for profits for themselves. And this angered the peasants, and the French decided to restrict freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and they imprisoned many nationalists. But opposition to the French continued to grow, though. So leading the opposition. So the Indo-Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1930. They staged many revolts under their leader Ho Chi Minh, and the French decided to sentence him to death, but he escaped and continued to lead the rebellion against the French from the Soviet Union and China. Now, during World War II, a little bit before that, the Japanese took control of French Indochina in 1940. Ho Chi Minh returned to the area and helped form the Viet Minh. Like we said, was a group in Vietnam which wanted to, become independent and, form their own country, basically. So after the surrender of Japan, Ho Chi Minh stood in the center of a huge crowd in Hanoi and declared that the country was independent. Now, the French had no plan to release control of the area, so French troops moved back into the country by the end of 1945. They took control of the southern part of the country, and Ho Chi Minh vowed to fight from the northern part of the country for the southern part. So we have the French troops in the southern part of the country, and Ho Chi Minh says, no, we're going to fight back against that. In 1950, the U.S. decided to join the struggle. President Truman sent $15 million in economic aid to the country of France to help fight, the conflict in Vietnam. And over the next 4 years, most of the money for the struggle came from the United States. So France used a lot of the U.S.'s money to help fight this. Now, Ho Chi Minh, just as kind of a side note here, Ho Chi Minh had once received support from the United States to fight the Japanese during World War II, but now he was considered to be a communist aggressor trying to spread communism. In 1953, Eisenhower, now who was president, continues to support the French. President Eisenhower also discussed one of your vocab words, the domino theory, during a press conference, saying that that if one country's on the brink of falling to communism, a lot of them will fall. So basically, these countries that are in threat of being controlled by communism, if one falls, the rest will fall. So he basically is saying he doesn't want that to happen. In May 1954, the French were forced to kind of pull out of Vietnam and surrender. when the Viet Minh overran the French outpost Dien Bien Phu. From May until July 1954, France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, China, Cambodia, and Laos met in Geneva, Switzerland to discuss the current situation. So they had a meeting with the anti-communist nations of South Vietnam, nationalists, I should say, of South Vietnam. So remember, there's people who are opposed to communism in South Vietnam, and then those in the north who are in favor of it, who are the Viet Minh. Now, the agreement was known as Geneva Accords, and this established the temporary dividing line between both of them at the 17th parallel. So North Vietnam was communist, and then South Vietnam was not. So like I said, Ho Chi Minh and the communists would control North Vietnam, while South Vietnam would be controlled by the anti-communists. And there was an agreement that there would be an election to unify the country in 1956. After the French exited the country, the U.S. took a more active role in Vietnam. Okay, both President Eisenhower and President Kennedy decided to support the anti-communists in South Vietnam in terms of aid. South Vietnam's president, Nguyen Dien Diem, he sees that, Ho Chi Minh is very popular, and he decides that he's not going to participate in the countrywide election in 1956. So like I just said, he was very fearful that Ho Chi Minh was very popular and would overwhelmingly win the election. So, in agreement with the thought, the U.S. supported canceling a countrywide election. Now, the Eisenhower administration promised aid for the military and training for South Vietnamese troops if Diem reformed his government. Now, Diem failed to keep his end of the bargain. His corrupt government suppressed any form of opposition, and there was little to no distribution of land to peasants. Ho Chi Minh was well liked because he was, a national hero for, wanting the country to become independent. He was also well liked because he was distributing land to the peasants. But Diem, he was not well liked, and he was also restricting Buddhist practices. Diem was a devoted Catholic, so he was against the Buddhist religion, basically. So he restricted a lot of the Buddhist practices, which was a majority of people in Vietnam at this time. And in 1957, the Viet Cong began their attacks on the government and assassinated officials. So remember, the Viet Cong are people in South Vietnam who are communists, who are opposed to, the South Vietnamese government. So they began attacking the government and assassinating officials. Ho Chi Minh began supporting the Viet Cong in 1959. He supplied arms to the group through a network of paths along the borders of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and this will be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, President Eisenhower took little to no action against the violence, and he decided to continue to keep Nguyen Dien Diem, in charge of South Vietnam. And the Kennedy administration followed the same policy. They, decide to, basically sink or swim with this guy, and they keep him there. So Kennedy decided to send military advisors to Vietnam to help train South Vietnam's forces. He also supplied financial aid to Diem. So by the end of 1963, there were 16,000 military personnel in South Vietnam and in the area from the U.S. So continued problems. So the popularity of Diem continued to fall. To combat the growing threat of the Viet Cong in the countryside of South Vietnam, Diem, moved all villagers away to protected areas. So he moves them away from their homes. And a lot of people were upset with this, obviously being moved out of their homes. A lot of them were family homes they lived in for many, many years. But they were upset and angry at this. Diem also increased his attacks on Buddhism. The South Vietnamese government had destroyed Buddhist temples and imprisoned or killed Buddhist clerics. So in protest of this, several Buddhist monks and nuns burned themselves to death. And there's images of these monks and nuns burning themselves in busy intersections of towns and cities in South Vietnam. After seeing these horrific images, American officials urged Diem, please stop what you're doing, stop these attacks. but he refused. It was soon clear that for stability to occur in South Vietnam, Diem would have to be removed from power. On November 1st, 1963, a supported U.S. military coup, which is an overthrowing of the government, was successful at taking down the regime of Diem. So his government is out of power. Now, against the wishes of President Kennedy, Diem will be assassinated. So this is kind of an issue. And then, unfortunately, a few weeks later, President Kennedy will also be assassinated. So President Johnson. So before his death, President Kennedy stated his intent to withdraw forces from South Vietnam. Lyndon B. Johnson would increase involvement in the region. After Diem's assassination, more chaos came. Different leaders of the military tried to keep control in South Vietnam, but they were unable to, and the Viet Cong also increased their influence in the countryside as well. Now, Johnson did not want to seem weak in regards to the issue and believed that a communist takeover of South Vietnam would be a total disaster. On August 2nd, 1964, the American destroyer, the USS Maddox, it had a torpedo fired at it by a patrol boat from North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. So this U.S. destroyer is in the North Vietnam area, and the North Vietnamese ship fires a torpedo at this American ship. 2 days later, on August 4th, 1964, another U.S. destroyer and the Maddox were off the coast of North Vietnam when crews reported enemy torpedoes. Now, both American ships began firing without really seeing or hearing any enemy gunfire. So this will come into question about, whether or not, these ships, really needed to do that. But this supposed attack prompted Johnson to launch bombings against North Vietnam. Johnson also asked Congress for powers to prevent future acts of aggression against the U.S., and Congress did approve the request with only 2 senators not voting in favor of it. So the Tonkin Gulf Resolution received approval on August 7, 1964. Again, this gave broad support of powers to the president to take action in Vietnam. Now, one of the things that, again, was kind of going on is that Johnson did not tell Congress or the American public that the U.S. was leading secret raids in the area. That's why the American ships were there in the Gulf of Tonkin. Many people thought, the ship was just out there and they weren't really doing anything, but they were conducting secret raids on the area. So again, more kind of controversy going into the Vietnam War. In February 1965, President Johnson authorized Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder involved the first sustained bombings against North Vietnam, and combat soldiers from the U.S. arrived on the ground in Vietnam during the same year in March of 1965. So by June of 1965, more than 50,000 U.S. soldiers began fighting the Viet Cong in the area. Okay, so by June of 1965, the U.S. has pretty much committed to fighting this conflict. Alright, so our closure. How did the United States become engaged in the conflict in Vietnam? Think about the different presidents, starting with President Truman, President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, and then finally President Johnson. Think about how the United States gradually, eventually became involved to sending troops into Vietnam. And then next week, we'll take a look further at how the United States became really involved in the war in Vietnam and the trouble it's going to cause at home as well. All right, so have a great rest of your day or night, and talk to you soon.